Good Tuesday morning. Today's an interesting text. Okay, it's again in St. Matthew's. It's the 15th chapter. Boy, he was just stuck in controversy. Can you imagine the early church when, for Matthew, is writing to the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem, the conflict they must have felt, the Jewish Christians must have felt, between what were their traditions and their reach and the Mosaic law and the great traditions and the rich traditions. And they were in a revivalist period. It's when the Pharisees and the scribes were the heroes. They were restoring the law. This is a great period. And yet Christ, not only, he in a sense, he breaks that. He says he's above it. He transcends it. Can you imagine if you were a Jew and you're 35 or 40 years old, you lived your whole life and you've responded your whole life to this rich tradition, this restored tradition, the Mosaic law, okay? And the great traditions within your culture, your society, your faith. And here's a guy who's calling you to something greater, but it's almost in direct conflict with it, and insofar as he breaks the rules. And so you can see where the conflict in that early church had to be substantial. For those Jewish Christians, it had to be. Maybe I'm all wrong, I don't know. But I'm thinking it had to be. And it was because the very traditions that were so sacred to them are the very traditions he does violence to, in the sense of breaking the rules. Not immoral rules, Mosaic rules. And I'll show it to you. Some Pharisees and scribes came to Jesus from Jerusalem and said, "Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders?" That was a very good question. "They do not wash their hands when they eat a meal." And you could say, what's the matter with you? It's because that's a sacred event. I was in an Orthodox Jewish home about 10 years ago, and it's a sacred washing before you eat. This is not trivial. And it's not because you're just going to wash your hands. It's a ritual act that embraces the Judaic law. See? And Jesus summoned the crowd and he said to them, "Hear and understand. It's not what enters one's mouth that defiles a man, but what comes out of the mouth is what defiles one." He goes from the action of the washing of the hand to the keeping of rules, you see, now to the virtue underlying it. Not denying you should follow the rules, but what he's saying is the essence of it is internal, it's interior, it's not external. See? He's also thrown out the whole kosher law. Kosher. It's not what enters the man that defiles him. Food. It's not. All right? No. So he's thrown out the Jewish law with regard to kosher foods. I didn't say that right. See? But what comes out of his mouth is what defiles him. The virtues of the heart. It's not what he eats. It's what he says and lives like. That's what defiles him. See? Or makes him. See? Then he said and then his disciples approached and said to him, "Do you know that the Pharisees took offense when they heard what you said?" No wonder they did. I would have. See? He said in reply, "Every plant that my heavenly Father has not planted will be uprooted. Let them alone. They are blind guides of the blind. If a blind man leads a blind man, both fall into the pit." Were they blind men? Not from a Jewish perspective. Those Pharisees and scribes were not blind. They were not blind. What made them blind, in a sense, is they failed to see what the law was meant ultimately to point to. The whole Judaic tradition, Mosaic law, was to point ultimately to the Redeemer, Christ. And they were not seeing Christ. It's the only way you could ever claim that these were blind people. And because they were committed to the law, they failed to see the purpose of the law, which was Christ himself. That's the only thing that makes sense out of this text, because you got to know the Pharisees were good guys. And they were simply upholding the Judaic tradition, the Judaic law, the Mosaic law. And unless you're a Christian, you can't see that as blindness. Because as a Christian, you start with Christ, and then you look at the Judaic Mosaic law. And you say this is what it was pointing. It was pointing to him. It was pointing to Christ, who was both the author of the law and in God, of course, and the completion and the purpose of the law. See? That Christ is the Redeemer. And what St. Paul tells us is, in that completion makes the law obsolete. The way a check is obsolete after you cash it. That's the example that Paul uses, the analogy. So I think I'm trying to think if I were a Jewish Christian in Jerusalem, the struggle I would have had. Namely, how do I look at the law that governed me, and a law of the heart as well as the external, the law, the Mosaic law, taught by these marvelous Pharisees and scribes, these brilliant, faithful men. How do I address that when Christ tells me it's over, it's obsolete? I complete it, I fulfill it, follow me. And move from, in a sense, the Mosaic law to the interior law of the heart. Belief and love. Okay? I gotta believe that in the early church, this was a tremendous struggle among Jewish Christians. It had to be. God, it had to be. I saw a weak analogy of that when the Second Vatican Council came out in the aftermath of it, and the changes in the liturgy and stuff, and you could see the conflict with people who had spent years, their whole lives, following a certain ritual, a certain kind of habits, moral as well as liturgical, and all of a sudden they seemed obsolete. Didn't seem to matter anymore. I can remember that. Yeah. When we moved from a kind of a juridic form of morality to a moral form of morality, as it were, a morality of the heart. And I can remember the chaos that occurred and the conflict, the inner conflict. I remember that in the order. Huge internal conflicts between good people, those who held on to the tradition and those who sought to transcend it, who went beyond the old rule, as it were. See? So I identify with this. I remember that internal struggle, and it's a deep internal struggle because it's a struggle with meaning. You're struggling for the meaning of your life, the religious but also your cultural meaning of your life. Those Jewish Christians had to be heroic at that time. And I think the men I'm thinking of men in the order, the men who persevered, who struggled through those crises. Those were real crises for about a decade. In the order, between the early 60s and the mid-70s, it sort of subsided by then, that there were many of these guys were heroic because they had to struggle with that deep inner conflict. A lifetime of a certain mode of religion to a significantly new mode that seemed to make the old mode obsolete, if not foolish. It's just the truth. And many men lost their faith in that conflict. I understand. I think I have an idea, an analogous one, I'm sure, of what the Jews must have gone through when they embraced Christianity. It had to be heart-wrenching at the same time as rewarding. They were following Christ, but he promised them the cross, not paradise. That's just the truth. Whenever you have a cultural conflict, it impacts every aspect of your life. And I think that's exactly what Matthew is addressing here, to a degree. He was struggling with it himself, I believe.